In this episode, we're going to focus on exam day tactics that help you stay calm, move quickly, and still give answers that would be defensible in the real world. Scenario questions can feel intimidating because they contain a lot of information, some of it relevant and some of it distracting, and they often try to push you into reacting emotionally instead of reasoning carefully. The good news is that you do not need to be the smartest person in the room to do well on scenario questions. You need a repeatable way of thinking that keeps you grounded in governance, evidence, and risk, and you need the discipline to avoid common traps like overconfidence, overgeneralization, or technical tunnel vision. Because this is the last episode in this list, we're going to make it a practical capstone that reinforces the habits you have built across the course. By the end, you should feel like you have a simple mental rhythm you can apply to almost any AAIA-style scenario without panicking or guessing wildly. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. The first exam day tactic is to treat every scenario as a control story, not as a technical puzzle. In an AI audit scenario, the question is almost never asking you to prove you can build a model or configure a system. It is asking whether you can identify where risk exists, what controls should exist, and what evidence would prove those controls are working. When you read a scenario, your calmness comes from recognizing familiar signals, like missing approvals, unclear ownership, weak monitoring, poor documentation, or risky data handling. Your speed comes from not trying to solve everything at once, because scenario questions often include multiple issues, and the exam usually wants the best next step or the most defensible conclusion. A defensible answer is one that a reasonable auditor could explain using evidence and standard assurance logic, even if the organization pushes back. If you anchor yourself in that mindset, you stop chasing details and start identifying control gaps and audit priorities. The second tactic is to quickly identify what stage of the AI lifecycle the scenario is describing, because the right answer often depends on where you are in the lifecycle. A system being planned has different risks than a system being deployed, and a system being monitored has different risks than a system being decommissioned. When you know the lifecycle stage, you can mentally narrow the control set you should be thinking about. For example, if the scenario is about a new release, your mind goes to approvals, gates, testing evidence, and rollback readiness. If the scenario is about a system that has been running for months, your mind goes to drift, performance monitoring, incident triggers, and oversight. If the scenario is about retiring a system, your mind goes to retirement criteria, dependency removal, and data cleanup. This tactic helps you move fast without feeling like you have to recall every concept at once, because you are using context to filter to the relevant control family. The third tactic is to separate facts from interpretations as you read, because scenario questions often contain statements that sound like conclusions but are actually just claims. A scenario might say the team believes the model is accurate, or the vendor assures them it is secure, or leadership is confident the rollout is controlled. Those are not facts unless the scenario provides evidence. Your defensible approach is to ask yourself what the evidence would be, such as test results, approval records, access logs, monitoring review records, or incident tickets. On exam day, you do not have to produce the evidence, but you do need to choose answers that reflect evidence-based reasoning. If two answer choices seem plausible, the more defensible choice is usually the one that either relies on documented evidence or seeks to obtain and validate evidence before concluding. This is one of the easiest ways to avoid traps, because exams often include an attractive choice that assumes the claim is true and a better choice that checks it. The fourth tactic is to prioritize by risk and materiality instead of by convenience, because scenario questions often offer choices that are easier but less meaningful. A common trap is selecting an answer that improves documentation style or reorganizes a team meeting schedule when the real issue is missing controls over deployment or weak monitoring that could cause harm. Another trap is selecting a technically impressive activity when the best audit move is to clarify ownership, define thresholds, or enforce approvals. When you are prioritizing, think about impact first, such as whether customers, money, safety, or legal compliance are affected, and then think about likelihood, such as whether the scenario indicates the problem is already happening. Also consider scalability, because an AI system can repeat the same error at scale, turning a small weakness into widespread harm. A COM exam approach asks what decision would reduce the most risk in the shortest time while remaining consistent with audit standards. The best answer is often the one that strengthens control operation, not just control intent. The fifth tactic is to look for the control that turns uncertainty into accountability, because scenario questions frequently revolve around ambiguity. If you are unsure whether a model is behaving safely, the audit move is not to guess. It is to require monitoring, testing evidence, and escalation triggers that make safety measurable and enforceable. If you are unsure who is responsible, the audit move is to define roles and approval authority so accountability is not left to informal assumptions. If you are unsure whether a change was controlled, the audit move is to examine change records, approvals, gates, and release readiness evidence. This tactic is powerful because it shifts you away from content debates and toward control design and operation. Exams often reward that because it reflects how real audits handle complexity. You cannot eliminate uncertainty in AI, but you can control how uncertainty is managed and how decisions remain defensible. The sixth tactic is to watch for language that signals weak control maturity, because certain phrases often indicate where the audit focus should go. If a scenario implies that approvals are informal, that monitoring is ad hoc, that exceptions are common, or that documentation is missing, those are red flags. If it implies that the model is being reused for a new purpose without reevaluation, that is another red flag because alignment and constraints may no longer hold. If it implies that the organization cannot reproduce a result or cannot identify what model version is in production, that signals weak configuration and version control. If it implies that users rely on outputs without oversight, that signals supervision risk and over-reliance. These signals help you answer quickly because you are pattern matching to the control families you already learned. You still need to read carefully, but you can reduce cognitive load by recognizing that many scenarios are built around the same few control failures. The calmness comes from realizing you have seen this story before. The seventh tactic is to choose responses that are specific and verifiable rather than broad and inspirational. Exams love to tempt you with answers that sound responsible but are not actionable, like improve governance, strengthen controls, or ensure fairness. Those phrases are not wrong, but they are not audit grade unless they point to something observable, like defining thresholds, documenting approvals, enforcing gates, conducting a specific evaluation, or establishing an escalation trigger. A defensible answer is one that could be verified in a follow-up review, because audit work is built around proof. If the question asks what the auditor should do next, the best choice is often the one that gathers or tests evidence in a way that confirms control operation. If the question asks what recommendations should be made, the best choice is often the one that closes a clear control gap and defines what success evidence would look like. This keeps your answers grounded and reduces the risk of selecting vague options that feel safe but do not truly address the scenario. The eighth tactic is to manage time by using a consistent reading rhythm that prevents you from getting stuck in the middle of a long scenario. A good rhythm is to read the question prompt first so you know what the exam is asking, then read the scenario details with that question in mind. As you read, mentally note the life cycle stage, the highest impact risk, and the control evidence that is missing or weak. Then scan the answer options and eliminate the ones that rely on assumptions, vague improvements, or actions that do not match the life cycle stage. This is not a shortcut in the bad sense. It is a way to focus attention where the exam expects you to focus it. Beginners sometimes read every scenario like a novel, absorbing details evenly, which wastes time and increases anxiety. A calm exam approach reads like an auditor, seeking risk signals and evidence gaps. When you practice this rhythm, it becomes automatic, and your speed increases without sacrificing accuracy. The ninth tactic is to protect yourself from overthinking by remembering that the exam is testing reasonable assurance, not absolute certainty. In AI auditing, you rarely get perfect information, and you rarely get perfect controls. The exam expects you to choose the most reasonable action or conclusion given the scenario, not to solve every possible future problem. This is where your evidence mindset helps, because you can answer with what is defensible, require evidence, evaluate control operation, prioritize high-impact risks, and recommend improvements tied to causes. If you catch yourself trying to imagine rare edge cases that the scenario does not imply, that is a sign you are drifting away from the prompt. Bring yourself back to what the scenario actually says, what it strongly suggests, and what the best control-focused response would be. Defensible does not mean overly cautious. It means aligned to risk and supported by reasonable audit logic. This tactic reduces stress because it gives you permission to be practical. The 10th tactic is to remember that AI-specific scenarios often include a temptation to focus on model internals when the audit issue is governance and controls around the model. You might see impressive technical descriptions, but the question may hinge on whether approvals were documented, whether monitoring is reviewed, or whether change management is enforced. Another common pattern is a scenario that includes a confident performance claim, but the audit focus is whether the organization has evidence to support it and whether it has monitoring to detect decline. You might also see a scenario about using AI within the audit function, where the real risks are bias, leakage, over-reliance, and hallucinated conclusions. In those cases, the best answers emphasize boundaries, data minimization, human review, and traceability, because that is what keeps the audit credible. Recognizing these patterns helps you avoid being seduced by technical detail and helps you pick answers that reflect audit principles. When you do that, you are also aligning with the exam's intent, which is to test assurance thinking rather than engineering skill. The 11th tactic is to use your connected storyline from the mega review as a mental map during scenario questions. When you are unsure what control fits, imagine where you are in the story: objective and constraints, data governance, development and testing evidence, deployment approvals and gates, monitoring and triggers, change and configuration discipline, oversight and supervision, analytics and trends, reporting and findings, and follow-up. The correct answer is usually the next control step that makes the story coherent and reduces risk at that point. If a scenario describes a system in production with rising complaints and no documented review, the story points to monitoring, review, and incident triggers. If a scenario describes an update rushed into production with minimal testing, the story points to change approvals, release readiness evidence, and rollback capability. If a scenario describes a model being retired but no plan for logs and training data, the story points to decommissioning controls and data cleanup duties. This map gives you speed because you are not searching randomly through memory. You are walking a path you already know. Calmness comes from structure, and structure is what this storyline provides. To close, remember that exam day tactics are not about tricks. They are about protecting clear thinking when pressure tries to narrow your attention. Calm comes from treating scenarios as control stories, quickly identifying lifecycle stage, and separating evidence from claims. Speed comes from prioritizing by risk, looking for verifiable control actions, and using a consistent reading rhythm that avoids getting lost in details. Defensibility comes from choosing answers tied to accountability, evidence, and practical control operation rather than vague intentions or technical fascination. Because this is the last question in your requested sequence, this is the last episode, and the best final reminder is that the AIA mindset is steady and evidence-driven even when AI feels uncertain. If you keep that mindset, you will not only choose better exam answers, you will also be practicing the kind of reasoning that makes AI governance safer in the real world. Carry that steady rhythm into the exam room, and you will find that scenarios become manageable because you know what to look for and how to respond.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.